Okay, welcome. This is Professor TOVANCHE, and we're continuing with our course, The African American Struggle for Equality. Today we're going to talk about well, as you can see in the title, From Africa to the Americas. So the large movement of people from Africa to the Americas as slaves. Now, when we talk about America, a lot of people say America, the Americas. This is America, right? The Western Hemisphere is America. The North America, South America. When we talk about America, really, at least in the early days, it's changed. Nowadays, we say United States is America, but for centuries, America was this whole region, the entire hemisphere, not just that territory, which would become the United States. The Americas, or America, really, the Western Hemisphere, we know will be conquered by people from various parts of Europe. Of course, we know that the English come, the Dutch, the French, the Iberians, all of these people are going to come. As you can see on the map, they're coming from Europe, right? So Iberians, in fact, are going to lead the way. And who are the Iberians? Well, those are, in fact, hang on, I'm having some technical difficulty here, and I do not know why it's doing that. It's not, okay, I see. Okay, good. When we talk about the Iberians, we're talking about the Iberian Peninsula, two countries today, right? Portugal and Spain. In fact, it is the Portuguese that would be the first modern country, the first modern Europeans come across the Atlantic or to venture out into the Atlantic to, in fact, skirt the African coast and to engage in the Atlantic slave trade. These were the Portuguese. I'm having a lot of difficulty. Hang on one second. I'm not able to see the slides that come next. Okay, there it is. I think this would be better. Sorry, as I said, low production value. Take one, and that's all we get. No, take two. I think this will work. If it doesn't, sorry, I'll work on it. Okay, so the Portuguese, these are the first modern Europeans to venture out, right, into the Atlantic, down the African coast, and engage in the Atlantic slave trade. And the Spanish, we know, will follow. Now, the Europeans are going to venture outward. They're going to migrate outward. And like many people throughout history, there's certain things that make people move. Historians call these push and pull factors. Why is this not showing? Oh, there it goes. Oh, let me just pop all these down. I don't know why it's doing this. Sorry, guys. Push and pull factors. So there are things that push people out from where they live and things that pull people out from where they live, right? So, for example, the Europeans, there's going to be several push factors here. The Europeans are going to they're going to leave for various reasons. Okay, this is not a good take because I'm still having problems and I do not understand why I didn't have this problem yesterday. Give me a moment, please. All right. Let's see if we can keep going. If I keep messing up, I'm just going to redo it. So there's going to be some push factors and pull factors. The push factors are those things that are pushing you out from where you live, and pull factors that are pulling you out from where you live. So, for example, what pushes Europeans outward from Europe? Why leave? Well, a lot of things, but we can point to some major factors. And some of these push factors involve the fact that Europe is changing right around the late 1400s. It's emerging from the Middle Ages, also called the Dark Ages. It is coming into a modern world in a sense. examples of this are the fact that nation states are being formed. It used to be that Europeans were very feudal, right? They were sort of tribal. You had kingdoms and strong men and warlords and all that kind of stuff controlling different areas. But over time, these were consolidated, right? And so what you're seeing is that actual nation states, today we would call these countries, being formed. So they're developing strong economies, or at least trying to. They're developing militaries, right, for the nation. And of course, with all of this is a strong sense of nationalism, the idea that my kind of person is better than yours, right? And so what we're seeing here is the rise of a national identity also tied to ideas of national and ethnic superiority. Ethnic meaning culture, and of course, racial superiority. Now, not really racial so much among the Europeans. In fact, we're going to see, the English are going to hate the Spanish. The Spanish are going to hate the English. These are all white people in Europe. And, the French are going to hate everybody. Everybody's going to hate the French, and so forth and so on. So they're going to have this sense of nationalism and superiority that's going to be pushing them outward. We'll talk more about this in a moment as to how that happens. But you can imagine if, in fact, Europeans look at each other and think, you might look like me because they're white, right? But I am better than you. You know that when they encounter people who don't look like them, Native Americans, but of course Africans, right? There's going to be a strong sense of superiority. So that's on the rise. Nation states, nationalism, but science is also on the rise. Scientific learning is on the rise. We're going to see advances in navigation and shipbuilding. So they're going to have the tools to actually venture out into the world. And another major push factor is religion. We're going to actually talk about this more in a moment, but here's the thing: religious zeal, right? The fervor for religion is very strong at this time. People in Europe will kill, they will die for their religion. So all of these things are sort of entwined together. There's also, of course, going to be pull factors, things that are pulling them out. One thing that is pulling them out is that there's glory to be found out there, glory for the nation, right? We want to be, if we are a brand new nation, you're a brand new nation, we want to beat you to the outside world. It's kind of like the space race in the 1960s when the United States was engaged in a race to get to space under JFK primarily, right? The JFK administration said, we're going to put a man on the moon by 1960, whatever it was, or by the end of the decade. And they had done this in large response because the Soviet Union had actually launched a satellite into space, right? So they want glory. They want to be the first ones there, much like the people who left Europe in the early days. They want glory for their nation. But of course, they want the riches of Asia. We know that, right? So that's one of the major reasons that they venture out. The riches of Asia, the spices and so forth. But of course, they want conquest for God. Religion is a major, major motivator. Now, religion is pushing them out because it's like, God wants me to conquer, but they realize that there's a lot of souls out there that need to be saved, so to speak, from their point of view. So we will save these souls, but these souls will also be made soldiers in God's army. So these are major, major factors that are pushing them. And the Portuguese, as we said, are going to be the first ones to sort of engage in this kind of thing, right? They're going to be the pioneers of exploration. We're going to see that technology allows them. I'm just going to pop all these down. I don't know why it's doing that. Technology is going to allow them to go deep into the Atlantic. The Portuguese develop a special ship. It's called the Caravel. It's the first real modern ocean-going vessel. The first ocean-going vessel that we know of, right? That can go out deep, deep into the Atlantic. They also not only develop the Caravel, but they make advances in the astrolabe. The astrolabe is this tool that can be used to navigate, right? You navigate through the stars, and I don't know anything about this stuff. I'm not a sailor. Maybe some of you know. But you are, it's one thing to have a ship that can carry you deep into the ocean, but if you can't navigate out there, you can't navigate back, right? You might be able to get out there, but you can't, if you don't know where you're going or where you've been, you might not make it back. And so together, the fact that there's a ship and an astrolabe that can allow the Portuguese to get out there, that's going to set the stage for exploration. They're going to sail down along the African coast. They're going to discover, quote unquote, certain islands that are going to be crucial to further exploration for themselves. They're going to discover the Canary Islands and the Azores, these islands right off the coast of West Africa up there, right? And they're going to, in fact, build small settlements on these islands, but more than anything, they're going to use these islands in the Atlantic to grow sugar. We're going to talk about the importance of sugar in a moment, but they're going to develop the sugar plantations there, and they're going to come down the coast of Africa picking up slaves. They're going to use their islands as stepping stones to Africa to get farther and farther down. And eventually, they will make it all the way around the coast of Africa, at least the southernmost point of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope. And it's the Portuguese that do this. Excuse me, they do this in like 1488. A guy named Vasco da Gama, right? Vasco da Gama was a Portuguese sailor, and he actually is the first European to venture from Europe all the way around the African coast. And so, because of all of this exploration, the Portuguese begin taking Africans. They take them from, very early on as slaves. And they take them to Portugal itself, right? And in Portugal, they're not working huge plantations, none of that, because there's no sugar plantations in Portugal, at least that I know of. I don't believe that. What they're doing actually is engaging in domestic slaves, right? So they're working in people's homes, or they're working in people's place of business. A lot of these slaves are taken to work trades, right? Wagon wheel makers and so forth, right? Blacksmiths or whatever. And so those taken to Portugal have a particular sort of experience. But those taken to the Sugar Islands are going to have a whole different experience. The Sugar Islands in the Atlantic are where you're going to see brutal treatment. These sugar islands are highly profitable. Sugar. Why is sugar so important? Well, first of all, I should tell you, sugar actually had been transported from Asia by the Portuguese. The Portuguese had been in Asia trading for a long time, and sugar is a great commodity at this time. Now, we know it as a sweetener, and so did they. And for them, they also believed it to be sort of medicine, right? Sugar gives you energy, right? I mean, you guys know what I'm talking about when you talk about people having a sugar rush, right? And so it's sort of has an upper amphetamine-like effect. And so they see this as a medicine. But there's one other thing that's really important with regard to sugar, and that is that sugar can be transformed, converted into molasses, and molasses is easy to, of course, transport, but molasses can be transformed into something that a lot of people love at this time, and that is rum. People love to drink. Rum is made of sugar. And so this is an example of a highly profitable Asian spice that can now be actually exploited by not even going to Asia anymore. And so these sugar islands are going to be hugely important for the Portuguese and for other Europeans later on. It's highly profitable. Now, sugar, though, is going to require a very hot and humid climate. Very hot and intensive labor. So you can see what this means. Talking about needing intensive labor, well, you don't want to pay somebody when you can force them to do what you want. And so it is going to be the initial engine driving the slave trade. It is among sugar, that is, among the first crops that will be brought to the New World. And because it requires intensive labor, back-breaking labor, stoop labor, where you're stooping down almost all day, and because it requires to grow a hot human climate, right? It's going to be a brutal existence for the people who are enslaved. Now, the Portuguese can't just bum rush Africa. They can't just invade and conquer Africa and take people from wherever in Africa they want. There are things that are holding them back. That is disease. A lot of Europeans die from African diseases, especially malaria. And Africans tend to have um, uh, um, some immunity to malaria, but the Europeans, of course, did not. And so disease keeps them out. And also, there are some powerful tribes that force them back, even powerful kingdoms and tribes that say, whoa, whoa, why are you coming in here? Even those of you who maybe aren't so afraid of malaria, you got to be afraid of us. We don't want you here. And so powerful tribes with armies would force them back. So here's the thing. The Portuguese realized that they must trade for slaves with local Africans. And in fact, African slaves would be traded, as we know, by other Africans. Trade networks for slaves had long existed in West Africa, and it's West Africa that we're talking about, right? Now, trade networks had long existed, right? Where there were people who were traded for goods, goods being traded for goods, people being traded for goods, and so forth. So slavery has deep roots in Africa. It goes all the way back to at least the Egyptians, right? The Nubians also. And it exists at the time of European exploration. So this is one thing that people point to when they say, well, why do you make a big deal about US slavery? The Africans did it. Many people point to this fact of the history of African slavery, maybe not to justify what was done in the United States, but perhaps to smooth the harsh edges of our own history of slavery. Some people point to this, but here's the thing. There was a difference. Atlantic slavery will be the worst form of slavery that the world has ever seen. All the worst aspects of all the worst slave systems in the world are brought to bear in the Americas. It is so harsh that eventually some African kingdoms decide to stop trading in slaves. They say, whoa, wait a minute. We thought we didn't understand what you meant by slavery. Our sense of slavery, our tradition of slavery is different. And we're going to talk more about this later on. But for the Africans, they didn't realize that the Europeans would engage in such brutality. We will talk about some of these differences in later sessions. Excuse me. Now, the people who are captured will be, of course, marched. They will be marched to the coast from the interior by other Africans. They're going to be marched westward. They're going to be chained together as they move toward the Atlantic. They will be malnourished. They're going to be kept in pens open to the air, open to the elements, the environment. They're going to be forced to carry supplies. They're going to be brutalized as they go. This is going to be a terrible, terrible journey along the coast, or toward the coast, I should say. A lot of these people are left to die. I mean, if you are sick, if you are injured, then you're worthless to me. Nobody's going to trade for you. And so as they move down this terrible journey toward the coast, they are living miserable, miserable lives. And let me tell you something. Africa is massive. Africa is huge. What does this mean? It means that this trip can sometimes take a year. Countless people die before they even reach the coast. And when they're accumulated on the coast, they're housed in what are called barracoons. These are, like what you see in the picture here, basically these open air sorts of cells, and they're barely kept alive. There's no protection from the weather, the elements, the climate. There's very little food. They're given enough food just to be kept alive, just to keep living. And so they're put in barracoons. Some of them are put into actual European forts. The Europeans build forts along the coast of West Africa with the sanction, with the okay from local African leaders. They build European trading forts. An example of this would be Elmina Castle, which was built in Ghana on the west coast of Africa in 1482, where these people would be packed into these pens, and they would be exposed. They would actually be put into cages, and they would be put in these dank, dirty, dark cells underneath the fort, and they're forced to exist in their own filth. A lot of people just die because of disease, and not just disease, but because they're not being fed right, and they are being worked as they move. And so it takes a toll. And when that happens, your immune system, of course, is lowered. And it's going to mean that you're going to be more susceptible to diseases, more likely to get them. Of course, they also encounter novel European diseases, right? So when they come in contact with the Europeans have stuff that the Africans didn't have. So they're gonna be waiting for weeks or sometimes months as more slaves are packed in, and then they're gonna be traded like animals, really. They're gonna be stripped naked. They're gonna be oiled up to make them look fitter, right? Because you know. My friend was a bodybuilder, and he'd always like oil himself up before a match because it makes you look all jacked up and all cut, right? And so they would oil them all up to make them look fitter. They're going to be poked and prodded like animals. Their teeth are going to be looked at, right? They're going to, their strength will be tested. Their health will be tested. They're going to look, they're going to look at teeth because it's a way to look at the age of someone, apparently, right? And they're going to be made to dance, to sing, to jump, to show how healthy they are. So they're separating the weak from the strong. The weaker ones will be sold into African slavery locally. Um, the strong who survive, and most of these would be young men, but some women and children, but mostly young men. You can imagine, 15, 16, 18-year-olds, right? They're going to be these are the ones who survive, and they're going to be branded with hot irons, because you have to tell once, if you're a Frenchman, you want your French brand. If you're a Spanish guy, you want your Spanish brand, and so forth. So the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, all of these, later on the Dutch and the English, they're all going to brand these people with hot irons. After enough slaves are accumulated, they will be marched out of the barracoons or their cells at and then loaded onto boats. Now, at the Almina Castle, that they would be underground, and they would come out of their cells underground and be transported, walked through tunnels underground, and the tunnel would open up onto the. Imagine you've gone through all this, and then you've been beaten, you're tired, you're hungry, you don't understand what's happening to you, you've never seen this kind of treatment before, you've seen people die along the way, and you've been laying in your own filth and so forth. Sometimes they'll spray you down with stuff, give you some saltwater bath, to clean you up just a little bit, and then they march you through a tunnel, and then you come out of the darkness onto this bright sunshine, sunshine and golden sands of beach or whatever. And then you're loaded onto this European boat, the floating prison, the slave ships. That door that they opened, they would start calling the door of no return. Once you went through that door from under Elmina Castle, out of the cells, and through that door, no return. Imagine this trip, right? These people come from different parts of Africa. They've seen all kinds of weird things already. They've never seen the ocean. They've seen now all kinds of things. Now, they're seeing the ocean and sailing ships, floating monsters. Now, this whole trade involves a lot of people, as we know. We know that powerful tribes and kingdoms will grow rich off the trade in humans and will continue to grow rich off the trade in humans even after they realize how dreadful their treatment is of these people. They had for a long time practiced slavery anyway, and the Portuguese are able to tap into that custom. They realize that the system of slavery is there, and so they're able to use it. But you have to remember something with regard to Africa, and we got to step back for just a moment and realize something. A lot of people say, well, how could they sell their own into slavery? But you have to understand, Africa is an invention. The term Africa was an invention because it was actually something that was used to label this entire continent of people that didn't think of themselves as Africans. These were tribal people. They did not see themselves as the same. The Europeans look at them and say, well, you look the same. You're the same color and you have similar traditions. Therefore, you're all the same. But they weren't. We're going to talk more about this down the road. Now, the Portuguese success is going to, of course, encourage others to go into Africa. It's going to encourage others to move out of Europe. The Spanish are going to be following right on the heels of the Portuguese. And it will be the Spanish who will dominate exploration of the New World in the 1500s. And just like others in Europe, they're going to be pushed by what are known as the 3 Gs: gold, glory, God. Gold, I mean, it's not really gold, but the spices and silks of Asia, right? In a sense, that's the gold standard of trade, right? The spices and silks of Asia. Eventually, the Spanish are going to go to the Americas and take out as much gold and silver as they can. They rape Latin America up with gold and silver. That happens eventually. But of course, as I said, there's the 3 Gs: gold, the next one, glory. Spain in 1492 is a brand new nation state. In 1492, it becomes consolidated into one country through the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella. Right? You guys have heard of these people, Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, the king and queen of Spain. These were people who ruled over different parts of what we understand as Spain. However, they married and consolidated the nation. So there's a new nation state. They're young, they're hungry, they want glory for their new nation. They have also engaged in expelling the Jews. In 1492, they kick out as many Jews as they can, unless they wanted to convert to Catholicism, Christianity. They kick them out. They've also, in 1492, expelled the Muslims. The Muslims from Northern Africa had conquered Spain some 800 years before. And so the Muslims had controlled what is today Spain for a long time, at least most of it. And so by 1492, not only is there a new nation state, Spain, but they have engaged in what is known as La Reconquista, the reconquest, to reconquer, retaking it from the Jews, in a sense, who they did not like because of their religion, retaking it from the Muslims, whom they did not like because of their religion, but also because the Muslims had conquered that area. And of course, that brings us to the 3rd G, God. The Spanish are going to see themselves as champions of Christianity, more specifically Catholicism, which they would say was the only real Christianity. By this time, there were other forms of Christianity that were cropping up. These were Protestants. We're going to talk more about the Protestant Reformation in a little bit, but basically, what's happening by this time is that people are starting to question the Catholic Church and go their own way. So they want to push Christianity as they see it in their form of pure Catholicism. So they want to do that, but they also want to weaken the Muslim nations. Not only do they want to push their form of Christianity, Catholicism, and overtake whatever Protestant sort of movement might be rising, but they want to weaken the Muslim nations that control the overland routes to Asia. If you see this map, you will see in the red there, those overland routes actually are controlled. That's the Middle East, right? Persia, Arabia, all that area there. They're controlled by Muslims. And so to get from Europe to Asia, right, they largely have to go over this overland route that is, or even the sea routes that are, in fact, you kind of got to pay a toll to get through, right? And so they don't want to pay that toll, but they also realize that the Muslim control of these routes to Asia, in fact, make the Muslims strong. So one of the main reasons, and I would probably say the main reason they support Columbus in this, in going westward to find a sea route, is because they want to take that power away from the Muslims and, in fact, assume it for themselves. And of course, they're going to be aided and abetted, supported by the Pope. The Pope will sanction slavery. It's not unchristian. So he says it's not unchristian to enslave African peoples, just like it's not unchristian to enslave Muslim peoples. And so with this religious sanction, they move out. And in fact, the Pope does them one better here, in a sense. The Pope, which at this time rules really over the European world, in a sense, because Europe is largely Catholic, right? The Pope was really involved in politics at this time, much, much, much more than he is today. Every now and then you'll hear the Pope today weigh in on something or another, but, you know, people don't take him as seriously as they would have back in the day, because back in the day, everybody was devoutly Christian, and most people by far were Catholics at this time in Europe, I should say. And so he actually makes a decree, and he makes a decree that the world is cut up in half. The Catholics are going to take it all. The world is cut up in half. Now we have the Portuguese and the Spanish who are venturing out. Well, he draws this line, as you can see, through the middle of what is today Brazil and, I guess, Greenland up there, right? And he says everything over to the left in yellow is going to belong to the Spanish, and everything over there, it really draws two lines, as you can see, right? Because the world is round. And so everything in the purple there in that area belongs to Portugal. I mean, the audacity, right? Just to cut up the world in half and say half belongs to you and half belongs to the other guy. And so, because of all of this, Columbus, we know, will sail for the New World. Now, in 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue. You all know that, I think. Columbus will sail towards the west. Does he know the world is round? Yes, he does. A lot of people think that, we're told, and I was taught this, maybe not you, you're a lot younger than I am, most of you probably, I'm guessing here. But I was taught that people did not know the world was round, that Christopher Columbus was this, this far-seeing explorer who saw the world in a way that nobody else did, that he decided to move westward, and that the sailors that he took with him were so afraid that they would fall off the edge of the earth, that we need to give him all kinds of props. That is Columbus. No, no, no. I still remember seeing in my history books, pictures of Columbus on one of his 3 ships, right? The Nina Pinta Santa Maria, whatever those are, and he's standing at the is it the stern or I don't know, the front of the ship, right? And standing up there, looking all stately and looking all powerful and authoritative, and sailors behind him like cowering because they're afraid that they're going to go off the edge of the earth. No, they didn't. Sailors knew the world was round. People who had some level of education knew the world was round. Aristotle, was it Aristotle? I think Aristotle had shown that it was round and so forth. But also sailors know this, because if you've ever been out on the ocean, you can kind of see the curvature of the earth. If you've ever been out on the ocean and you see a ship coming towards you, the first thing you see, of course, is the top of it, and then you see more of it. It's as though it's coming around, a rounded object. Now, of course, we got to give Columbus, Cristobal Colon, right, some props, because he went. He's the guy who went. So we got to give him that. But we shouldn't give him as much as we traditionally do. And so he goes and he actually sails to the Caribbean, right? You can see here Cuba. This island in the middle there is, the island of Hispaniola, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Hispaniola, where he lands and he discovers not a right word, encounters the Arawaks, right? And it's interesting because he makes several trips and he never steps foot on the mainland. He makes 4 trips. He never steps foot on the mainland. He's always in the Caribbean, and he writes in his diary or whatever memoir, before his death, that he reached Asia. I'm not so sure he believed it, but he writes it. Well, I don't know, right? This island of Hispaniola is, as I said today, Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Hispaniola is spelled, I should have put this in there, Hispaniola, Hispaniola. And so that's where he encounters these Arawaks, and he brutalizes them. He enslaves them. He opens, of course, the floodgates to further exploration by the Spanish and, of course, by others. And, of course, he opens the floodgates of slavery in the Western Hemisphere itself. The Spanish will take slaves wherever they conquer in the Americas. In fact, they first kill off pretty much the Arawaks. And, actually, Columbus enslaved some Arawaks first. And wherever the Spanish go in the Caribbean, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, all these, they will engage in enslaving the native peoples. Later on, they're going to enslave native peoples in Mexico and what would become Latin America and so forth. But eventually, they're going to use African slaves to replace natives in all these areas. African slaves are going to work under Spanish rule on sugar plantations in the Caribbean, places like Cuba and Jamaica and Hispaniola. They're going to work on sugar plantations, and later on, they're going to be working in the silver and copper mines of South America and the Caribbean, where they're going to be really working and living in horrible, dangerous conditions. A lot of them will be porters for the conquistadores. Porter, somebody who carries your stuff for you. As the conquistadors, as these people move through South America, Mexico, into the United States, Florida, the U.S. Southwest, all these areas, they're going to take Africans with them. A few here and there. Now, why did the Spanish and the Portuguese also use African slaves, even when the Portuguese come to what is today Brazil, right? Because the Portuguese take over Brazil. They're going to encounter native peoples that they also enslave, but eventually they're going to switch to African slavery, the Spanish and the Portuguese. Why? Well, of course, there are riches to exploit in the Americas, so you need somebody to do the work for you because you don't want to, right? And you don't want to pay them because that costs money, obviously. So here's the thing. The native peoples didn't really work out as slaves, so to speak. First of all, they died from disease. The Africans had some immunity to a lot of the diseases that were brought over to the New World. They had some immunity to malaria, Africans, which is why among people of African descent today, you have people who suffer from what is known as sickle cell anemia. You may be familiar with this. Sickle cell anemia, it's where the red blood cell should look like a disc, right? Sort of a wheel or something. But people with sickle cell anemia have a sickle shaped, right? Kind of like a sickle, right? Kind of like a half moon kind of thing. And the reason that they have that is because that actually helps ward off somehow, I don't know, gives them immunity to malaria. The unfortunate part, though, of course, is that it can actually be, it can be fatal. Point is that Africans had some immunity to disease. The native peoples did not. And so, because they've been separated for so long, and there's a whole story behind that I'm not going to get into. But it's not just disease. There's always native peoples who would resist. Native peoples would draw on their tribal ties. They would come together and form alliances with other tribes. They know their home terrain, and they would often fight back. And so that's one reason. These are several reasons that they switch, right? Disease, persistent native resistance. Another thing is, excuse me, is that they would often, that is, the native peoples have Spanish priests sort of looking out for them. The Spanish priests would often advocate for native peoples. Eventually, Spain would outlaw their enslavement of native peoples. An example of someone who did this was a guy named Bartolomeo de las Casas. Bartolomeo de las Casas, he was a Spanish friar, a priest of sorts, right? He's a clergyman. Let's leave it at that. Spanish friar. And what we know about this period of time and what the Spanish did comes largely from his accounts. Most of what we know about the treatment of native peoples and so forth. And he was a major, he became over time. He wasn't there initially. Eventually, he becomes an opponent of slavery, the enslavement of native peoples. And he actually says, you know what? These people are, children of God and so forth. We must convert them. You shouldn't use native peoples as slaves. You should use Africans, is what he says. Now, he later on backtracks on that. He says no. And in fact, later on, as the brutality of Africans increases, you're going to see more Spanish priests and friars actually pushing against the enslavement of people generally. At least the harsh treatment of slaves. Let me put it that way. And so that is the Spanish and the Portuguese, right? A lot of them, they want the riches. This native slaves don't work out. Also, they're going to have Africans who will just provide them slaves, right? That they don't have to go into the interior. We have the Africans actually, kind of, to put it badly, breaking them in as they move from the interior to the coast. So throughout the 1500s, the Portuguese and the Spanish are going to transport several 100,000 slaves to the Americas from Africa. They will bring them over what becomes known as the Middle Passage. This, of course, is a brutal, brutal sea route between Africa and the Americas. Middle Passage. This Middle Passage, once they get on board the boat, right, they've already gone through the whole Barracoon experience, right, on the coast. They've gone through the whole experience of being dragged across Africa, and now they're put on a boat, and sometimes it takes 1 to 3 months just to get to whatever destination they give you. takes several months. I mean, sometimes the winds aren't all that favorable. These are sailboats after all, right? And of course, they stop at islands here and there as they bounce around all these tiny islands in the Caribbean, stopping for more trading and so forth. And these, of course, are floating prisons, often carrying hundreds of slaves, often packed very, very tightly. There was among enslavers, these slave owners, these slave traders, a debate. Should we engage in tight packing or loose packing? Tight packing is where they would pack as many slaves as they could onto a boat. I think you are all familiar with this picture, right? This, of course, is a picture of the lower deck of a boat, as though we had X-ray vision looking down, right? And so this would be tight packing. So a lot of people said we should engage in tight packing because that means the more slaves we have, the more money we make. However, some people said, no, let's engage in loose packing. Why? Because if you pack them all tightly together, the more likely they're going to die of something, especially disease. The idea is if we loosely pack them, then more will survive. So some people engaged in tight packing, some engaged in loose packing, but you know, this was a nasty, nasty experience. They're stuck below deck, no matter whether you're packed tightly or loosely, whatever. You're stuck below deck. You're shackled together and breathing the nasty, fetid air. You're breathing and smelling the stench of humans who are forced to lie in their own filth. You're underfed because they're not going to feed you more than enough to actually keep you alive. That, keeping people, I mean, food costs money, right? They're trying to make a profit here. Also, they would sometimes underfeed people as a means of control, right? You want food, then you won't be so jumpy with me, right? Sometimes they would feed one guy and not the guy next to him, so they would fight each other. So this was all a means of control. And can you imagine, I mean, being treated this way? And of course, there's the disease where they die of things like scurvy, right? Scurvy is a disease that's caused by lack of vitamin C, right? Which is why eventually a lot of the ships, a lot of sailors knew that they had to eat oranges or limes or whatever on ships, right? Because you get some vitamin C. They would die from scurvy, from smallpox, from measles, from all these sorts of things. And a lot of times they would die from something called the bloody flux, which is basically nasty, bloody, mucousy, nasty diarrhea. Let's just put it that way. You should, you should read the ship's surgeon's account. That is a primary source there. That is in your module. What's sad though is, I mean, a lot of these people died of that, and it's disgusting. But what's sad is that hundreds of thousands of children still die of this every year today around the world. People die of dysentery. Children do. Can you believe that? So these people are lying in their own filth, sometimes lying next to dead bodies. If 4 out of 5 of these slaves survive, then it is considered a successful journey in a sense. Now, sometimes women and children are allowed above on the deck. The idea is that women and children are less likely to revolt, and this would, if you remove the women and children to the upper decks, you exercise them a little bit, but you also reduce disease, is the thinking. But of course, we know that women are also used as sex objects. The sailors engage in sex with them. We can imagine that maybe sometimes somebody said, well, she consented, but I doubt she would have consented otherwise. This is really rape. No matter whether she, quote, consents or not in these circumstances, this is rape. And so what's ironic about this, think about this for a moment. These sailors would have sex with these African women. They know their people. They know their people. Male slaves are regularly brought on deck, not all of them at once, but those who were quote unquote behaving badly, right? Those who were not going to allow themselves to be enslaved, who resisted, they would they'd be whipped. Sometimes they would just have to undergo medical exams, to make sure that that you're still healthy. If you're not healthy, then they're going to chain you next to the other unhealthy ones, and then chain you to some rocks, and then slide you off the deck and into the bottom of the ocean. So they would undergo medical exams. They would sometimes be given these saltwater baths just to eliminate. Can you imagine the stench, even rising through the floorboards and everything? They would be made to exercise. It was called dancing the slaves. It's time to dance the slaves, they would say, to make them exercise, even while enchained. A lot of slaves died. A lot of them died this way. Can you imagine the spiritual and psychological trauma of all of this? Those who make it to the other side usually stop in the Caribbean. They stop in places like Cuba. Cuba becomes another clearinghouse for slaves, where they're sold to various European traders. They're shipped to various parts of the New World, and of course, where the slaves encounter, more disease, more brutality. This middle passage is going to be part of a larger network. It's going to be called the triangular trade, also called the Atlantic exchange, because some historians will say, well, triangle is too neat a term. It's not really a triangle, although I think we can point to three major points, and that is the Americas as one point, Europe as another, and Africa as a third. So that's why it's called the triangular trade, but people will often call it the Atlantic exchange because things move all over the place all the time along the Atlantic. The idea is that the Atlantic is not a separator. The Atlantic is a joiner, in a sense. The Atlantic is a facilitator of people coming together, a facilitator of trade. It is, after all, a waterway. So whatever, I'll probably just call it the triangular trade, whatever. You know what I'm talking about when I say that. This exchange involves the movement of goods and people around the Atlantic world. And a lot of nations get involved in it in the 1600s, right? The French, the Dutch, the English. The English and the Dutch, by the way, they're going to take over the slave trade in the 1700s. And so what you're going to see here is, just by the way, getting back to the triangle part of it, is that from the Americas are going to come lots of raw materials. So when you think about what's coming from the Americas, those are raw materials that are coming out. Usually. And from Europe, usually finished goods, right? Manufactured stuff going to the other 2 points. And the engine that's driving this all is the trade in human cargo. Human cargo that is in fact, they're seen as parts of this, human beings being seen part as this whole trade network that's making the engine run. Or at least they are the engine. This trade is the engine that makes the car run, so to speak, to put it kind of badly. I'm mixing my metaphors, but you get the point. How many Africans did they ship this way? Well, we're not sure, but historians say in the millions, and it's, probably more than 10 million. There were tens of thousands of trips that were made. Several million died on the sea voyage alone. The testimonies of sailors, passengers, even ship's captains, the testimonies about the Middle Passage are that sharks would swarm around the ships. The testimonies that they wrote down say, now there's some question about this. People have questioned it because they say, well, sharks wouldn't really act this way. But there's so many accounts of this that we have to give it some credibility in some sense, and that is that apparently sharks would swarm around slave ships, following them, maybe not waiting. We got to read these carefully. What is clear is that when people were thrown overboard, there were sharks there ready to get them. Some of these ships would leave a trail of blood for miles because they're not only are they whipping these people, right? Because you're about to get thrown overboard, you're going to fight. So you get thrown into the ocean bleeding. Imagine. So several million die on the sea voyage alone. More than 10 million were transported. We're not even sure how many of those made it, but we know that millions of these people probably died on the sea voyage alone. We don't even know how many people died in the interior of Africa. I mean, there are estimates, but we're getting into the millions here, and it's just like it's mind-boggling. Maybe half survived the trip from inside Africa to the New World altogether. Millions, of course, would make it. Eventually, slaves would outnumber Europeans in many areas, because in the early years, at least, and for a long time, actually, Europeans were more sort of engaged in this idea of getting money from the exploration. They weren't so intent on settling. The English are going to change this up, but the Spanish, the Dutch, right, the French, they're more about making money. Portuguese, they're more about riches, not settlement. What's the effect of all of this on Africa? Well, the slave trade, the Atlantic trade, is going to, in Africa, and I should have put this up there, but I'm going to just speak it. It leads, the trade in slaves leads to what people call internecine warfare. That just means you war amongst yourselves. What do I mean by this? Is that the fact that people are coming, Europeans are coming to Africa. Imagine you're an African warlord or king or whatever, and people are coming here to buy slaves. Well, you probably are going to want to give them as many slaves as possible, but so is the king down the road. So you're going to fight with that guy over the internal slave trade. So it creates a lot of conflict within Africa. Also, the slave trade actually leads to the depopulation of a lot of West African coastal cities. People don't want to live there because they're afraid that they're going to get caught up in the slave trade. A lot of historians say that this depopulation hurt Africa for centuries. Generations of young people, and they're not taking the old and the sick, they're taking young people in the prime of their lives. That these people were taken by the millions out of Africa, and that drained Africa of a vital source, a vital natural resource, in a sense. Right? It drains, Africa of workers, of, you might have heard of brain drain. It drains Africa of people who might have engaged in some vocation or career that would have benefited Africa in the short to long term. Now, some historians say no, Africa was so large that, in fact, this didn't have that effect. But when I read this stuff, I can't help but imagine how easily how in fact it probably did go, and that is that this depopulation hurt Africa for a very long time. We should recognize that Africans are going to have a varied impact, right, on the New World. We should recognize that Africans will be here even before the English come. Africans are going to be in what is the United States today before English come. They're going to be in Spanish Florida before the English come. And they're going to fuel, from the very beginning, the economic growth of the European nations. They're going to fuel, because labor is crucial to the making of wealth. In fact, Adam Smith, right, who's the father of capitalism in a sense, he wrote the famous book Wealth of Nations. Whatever, that's way down the road. But the point is this, he had this argument, and that is that labor is the source of all wealth. And so the African slave trade and African slavery is going to fuel the economic growth of Europe, making them stronger, making them better able to exploit the world. It's going to fuel the creation of colonies, the United States. So they're going to have a tremendous impact, slaves are. Not all of them who came here will, though, that is, not all Africans, are going to merely toil until death as slaves. Many are going to find their freedom and work as free men. A lot of these people, no matter whether they are enslaved or not, are going to have what historians like to call agency. An agent. To be an agent is to be an actor, to be able to act on something outside of yourself. These people had agency, meaning they had the capacity to choose paths for themselves. Even though they were enslaved, they had agency because they were able to make some choices in their lives. Despite the horrible circumstances in which they found themselves, they were able to make choices for themselves. We're going to see this more down the road when we talk about African agency in terms of resistance of slavery. We'll talk about it a little bit in just a moment, and we're going to talk more about this. Is going to become clearer, this idea of agency. Now, some Africans actually participated in the conquest. Some historians think that some Africans actually participated with Columbus on his voyages that came later. I don't know about the first one, but his later voyage. Remember, he did 4. But there were some Africans who were conquistadores. There are, who went to Puerto Rico and Cuba and Mexico. An example of this is a guy named Juan Garrido. He was enslaved by the Portuguese, but he gains his freedom right around the year 1500. And he changes his name from whatever African name he had, and he converts to Catholicism. In a sense, he's becoming white under the Spanish culture, in a sense, because he's doing everything he can. He's converting to Catholicism, changing his name, and he's trying to mix in. He helps conquer Cuba. He helps actually conquer the Aztec city of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, Tenochtitlan, for those of you who are interested, right? He helps conquer them. So a lot of these guys, Africans, not all Africans are in fact slaves or remain as slaves. A lot of them are going to be in the Spanish military, and some of them will be allowed some sense of upward mobility. Now, let's not take this too far because there's still a lot of racial issues here, right? But although initially slaves, some of them are going to be able to rise in Spanish society to a point. They're not going to be king, that's for sure. And so they have this agency, meaning they're able to do something with their lives, despite the horrible circumstances. Slaves themselves, even slaves resist, right? Sometimes they engage in suicide. Now, is that a form of resistance, or is that just giving up? Well, I can't say. But from a historian's point of view, some people would say these people made a choice, that capture was harsh enough, and that they were going to take their lives into their own hands because that is a choice. A lot of these people had been dragged across the ocean, across Africa, and then endured all of that, coastal living stuff that we talked about, Elmina Castle and the barracoons and all of that. And then they're going to be put on a ship. And if they see a chance to jump off the ship, they're going to do it. Not always, but some of them do. You see, a lot of these people also feared that they didn't really know where they were going. Nobody's telling them anything. They only have stories. And the stories, by and large, are that they're going to be cannibalized, that these people, these Africans, are going to be cannibalized by white witches and sorcerers, that they're going to be part of some sort of ritualistic, religious whatever. And they say only this could account for this harsh treatment I've suffered. So they decide that death is the way to go, that death means going to their ancestors. So some of them refuse to eat, some of them jump overboard. And it's hard for us to imagine this, I think. Ironically, this sort of death may have left them feeling incomplete, because from the African perspective, as is the case with many, many people, that this was an incomplete death, because you're supposed to have a ritual that your people have for you to pass you over properly to the other side. And so, the question is, did these people really believe that they were going to the other side, or would they live in some sort of limbo? I don't know. The point is this, simply this, and that is, it's hard for us to imagine these circumstances that would lead someone to resist, I suppose, in this way, to decide to end their lives, even though everything about their culture says you don't do this, because you have to live an honorable life and live an honorable death, or have an honorable death and be celebrated in a certain way. But that's not, of course, the only way. Most people who are enslaved resist through running away, right, escaping, or sometimes violent rebellion. We're going to talk more about this. And they will resist their African captors, even in the interior. But it's very, very difficult to do that, because, again, once they're out of their own little area, they don't know anybody. Even if they get out, other Africans are really not their friends, you see. In fact, in the coast, or toward the coast, or along the trade routes that became commonly known as trade routes, if an African escaped, sometimes they were brought back because they would get money for them. Other Africans would get money for returning them, or you could actually just take the person who ran away from the slave traders and sell them yourself within the African slave trade. That's money. So they resist the African captors. They also resist Europeans. They resist the Portuguese and Spanish traders, the French traders later, and Dutch and all that. In fact, we know that in some coastal cities, when Portuguese and Spanish ships approached, we know that they would sometimes approach the coast of Africa, I should say. We know that they were sometimes attacked from the shores by Africans. So they recognize them as man stealers, so to speak. In fact, we know that by the way, once you got on board a slave ship, you may go straight into the ocean, or you may in fact just skirt the coast, going from one African coastal city to another. And when the slaves realized that they were close to a coastline, they would often engage in ship rebellions aboard the ship, trying to take over the ship. Women often contributed to this because, remember, they had more access to the top decks. And so sometimes when ships pulled into other African ports to pick up more slaves, the slaves would get riled up at the side of the coast. Sometimes the coastal people would harass and attack the ships and the sailors. Some slaves would revolt right in the middle of the ocean. Try to take over the ship, even though they didn't know how to sail. They would resist their African captors, they would resist the European traders, and they would resist, ultimately, the quote-unquote masters, enslavers. They would run away. They would in some places, especially in Spanish territories, and later on, even in the southern parts of the United States, they would actually run away and form their own communities out in the woods or jungles or whatever. These were called maroon communities. Running away would become very common, and maroon communities actually cropped up here and there, where people understood, slaves understood. These people aren't stupid. They understood that if they got away, they would be able to maybe make it out there in the middle of this unknown jungle or forest. And slave communities called not slave communities, excuse me, maroon communities of former slaves cropped up. And sometimes they got so big that they actually sometimes actually ended up negotiating with Europeans in town. It's really interesting. Now, there's much more to this, but the point is, African people who were enslaved they were not mere victims. Now, I do not shy away from the word victim. People like to shy away from that. I think that, people say these survivors. Survivors is too simple a term. It's too facile a term because it takes emphasis away from the actor, the person who's actually doing the victimizing. There are victims in this world, and it's not to say that that's the only thing you focus on. I think it's important to focus on and to recognize the early struggles for freedom. Now, a lot of people see slaves in history as mere objects, as something, as a thing that was done to. And a lot of people don't see them as subjects, as people who do things. Right? They see them as objects. A lot of people see it this way. And it's really a misunderstanding. It's really of how history was taught. Africans did fight back, as we've seen, but a lot of people don't know that. Many modern folk don't know that. In fact, I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, where I went to East High School. We were all pretty well poor, and this was back in the 80s. And this high school was like, I don't know, 70-something% black, and then the rest of us, right? Mixture of usually poor white working class, and occasional Chinese, the Puerto Ricans. I was like the only Mexican around. It was Cleveland. But the point is this: like my black friends, when we would learn about slavery, they would say, "Man, if I had been a slave, I wouldn't have taken it. I would have done this. I would have done that. Maybe, maybe not." We have, in fact, a lot of evidence that people did fight back. They fought back in various ways, and we will see more of this later. So a lot of the history that we've learned, teaches that, slaves were basically docile, that they didn't do a whole, no, they had agency. A lot of the history also covers up the nasty aspect, the severity of their captivity. And so if you just kind of paint them as docile creatures in a sense, who really, suffered a lot, but who, we don't really talk about how severe the suffering was. And then what we do then is take away what it took to survive. We take from them we misunderstand what it took to survive under these circumstances. The strength of will to survive, let alone the strength of will that it took to free oneself, to resist, to run off, despite the consequences that you may encounter. We have to recognize that there have been these early struggles for freedom. Dare I say, early struggles for equality, as early as the slave trade. When we think about civil rights, when we think about equality, we must realize, or at least consider, that the civil rights movement, this push for equality, may have earlier origins than a lot of us have long recognized. Okay. I think I'm going to leave it there. You have, of course, enough information for test 1. Remember that everything in the module for the week is going to be fair game for test 1. So make sure you look at that stuff. Read it all. Okay. I'm glad you listened. I hope you listened all the way, and I hope you got something out of this. All right. So I'm going to end it here, and of course, soon we'll be moving on to the next module. I will sign off. Take care, and bye.